how can anything be achieved in our world, or how can we know ourselves, the deeper essence of ourselves, without being humble? Can we know ourselves by being active, or can we know ourselves by projecting our agenda onto the world? Or do we know ourselves in the opposite direction, from the other perspective? Is it from blunting our sharpness? Is it from refining our consciousness? Is that how we heal the perceived problems in the world, and also problems within ourselves?
Namaste. You're listening to the Savannah Podcast. Join us on an exploration of Eastern spirituality, yoga philosophy, and conscious living for the new age. This podcast is a production of SavannahSpirit.com, where you can find a large selection of Om and yoga clothing, spiritual jewelry, and unique fair trade gifts from the Far East. Now here's your host, Ashton Szabo.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Savannah Podcast. I'm excited for our show today. Before we dive into our topic, I want to remind you, head over to savannahspirit.com/contest and enter in each week to win a possible prize for the weekly contest that we have over there. Now, our show today is all about humility, in particular, the science and practice of humility. Our guest today is Jason Gregory. He's an author, teacher, filmmaker, and international speaker. He produced the documentary The Sacred Sound of Creation, and he's written the books Enlightenment Now and The Science and Practice of Humility, and his next book is coming out in May of this year called Fasting the Mind. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on, Ashton. It's a pleasure.
So you've traveled a lot. You're actually currently living in Thailand. Tell us a little bit about your background and your travels and how you got to all of the work that you do now.
Well, it was kind of a gradual process, you could say. I mean, I never grew up in a traditionally religious or spiritual family. It was when I got older, in my adult life, I had more curiosity, especially in Eastern thought. And my wife, coincidentally, is from Korea. And so she had been involved in a lot of meditation. She had visited many monasteries before we had met, and so forth and so on. So she kind of kicked my butt, and we left Australia. And then over that time, I spent many years in places like India and Nepal and here in Thailand and other places in Southeast Asia and the Middle East too. But over that time, my curiosity for the East got deeper, and I just kind of felt, I don't know if I was really seeking this path as an author and as a teacher. I kind of just sort of fell into it over the years, being in India and sitting with teachers and meeting many, great people and students. And as I wrote The Science and Practice of Humility, I went back to Australia and then lectured and lectured in America and so forth and so on. And so over time, in India, I was involved especially with Mahayana Buddhism, with Vedanta, classical yoga. And over here in Southeast Asia, I was introduced to Taoism and Zen Buddhism, and was engrossed in a lot of practices, the philosophy. And actually, I lived in Korea studying Zen for a little bit of time, 7 months. And just all of these experiences contributed to the work that I do. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in any particular field, but I say that what gives me maybe an advantage over some other authors and teachers is I have a bit more of an objective perspective of some of the traditions and how they would benefit us in the contemporary world. Like someone who is not even familiar with Eastern thought, like there is a relationship between the ancient way of the East and the way that we live in the modern day. And that's also being discovered in cognitive science and psychology as well. So if anything, that's what my work is primarily focused on, is bringing, what I believe is the beneficial aspects of Eastern thought into the modern world. And so that's basically my background. There wasn't any one aha moment. I've sat with many teachers and students, and to begin with, I would say probably I met Mooji a while back, if you know Mooji, and I sat in on a lot of satsangs when I was a bit younger, and that kind of, I guess you could say, cleared a lot of dirt away from my eyes, and that's how I was introduced to Vedanta and that's what, and one of the places that I really love in the world, Tiruvannamalai. That's one of the reasons I actually went to Tiruvannamalai was Muji. But since then, it's become a place very special to me. And yeah, so there wasn't anything really special. I know a lot of people always have these aha moments and this and that, but for me, there was just numerous aha moments, and I never really chose to be an author and a teacher, but it just kind of happened, you could say.
Well, one of the things that you mentioned, it's something that I relate to and very much appreciate about your insights and your work, is that you draw from a lot of traditions. I think it's really easy when people get excited through an experience or one of those aha moments to get really tunnel vision into one particular tradition or one way of thinking. And it really can blind people to other things. It creates a lot of blind spots for people. And I mean, when going through your book, The Science and Practice of Humility, I mean, you're drawing from the Bhagavad Gita, from all sorts of Taoist sources, Hermetic sources, all over the place, which is great because it draws in these similarities, which I think is, as we open up more and more to a truly global society, we've got this understanding that, hey, we've got to find more than just our local view of things. We've got to take a more broad view and look at all these amazing traditions that have been everywhere in the world. So I really appreciate that insight and perspective that you bring to it all.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess I had that sort of perspective. A lot of the literature I used to read when I was younger was Alan Watts, Joseph Campbell, Aldous Huxley. And still, they're three of my favorite authors, and their perspective was always very vast. You know, so they always draw a lot of inspiration from many traditions, and kind of delivered a comparative religious blueprint for us to understand. You know, that we're not kind of all we're not separate and isolated to our certain beliefs, but we're actually connected to something much more vast. And, you know, when we understand that, then we can begin to maybe heal a lot of the wounds that we think exist in the world, and we can learn to accept each other. And I think that's very important in the modern day. And I know you're in California, so there's a lot of liberal people in California who think this way, but, you know, I think that's kind of the way of the future as well. You know, if we learn to accept each other and we understand each other's beliefs, that'll move us, you know, really forward, especially psychologically in our own evolution, you know, as a species. So,
well, it's great that you mentioned Alan Watts and Joseph Campbell. When I was living in Thailand, they were my lullaby to sleep. So I'd put in lectures of theirs on my headphones and just kind of lay in bed and go to sleep to them most nights, and hundreds of hours of lectures of theirs. So they're big influences of mine as well. Now, we're talking about humility today, and I want to kind of start from the ground floor to get your perspective of, where does humility come from? Is it something that you think is innate inside of us? It's already there, fully and complete, and we simply have to reveal it? Or is it something that we need to cultivate and bring in from you know, I mean, taking aside a dualistic approach, but this idea that it's something that's cultivated and built rather than opened and revealed? What's your thought on that?
It's a great question. You know, you can look at both views and you can see that, you know, there's a lot of evidence that leans towards one or the other. I actually believe it's innate, and the reason I believe that is because when you look into a lot of Eastern thought, especially when you look into India and you look at a lot of the masters from India, if you look at Ramana Maharishi, you look at Gautama the Buddha, you look at a lot of these great teachers, that it seemed that the humility they had, what I call the science of humility, was something that they kind of naturally revealed through their own process of enlightenment, if you say, or just refining their consciousness. They had this deepening of the psyche. And, you know, for example, if you look at Lao Tzu in Taoism, you know, one of the key things in Taoism is that humility is kind of the most paradoxical force in the universe. You know, by intentionally, in a sense, taking the low road, you're actually having a larger effect than meeting the world with brute force or meeting the world with resistance. But I can see from the other perspective that if we look at it, for example, if you look at Taoism, if you look at a lot of the practices, if you look at Tai Chi, Qigong, if you look at just the philosophy in general, if you do especially from Confucius's perspective, if you look at cultivating, ethical and moral virtues, these have a way of training your character to become humble. And I would say that this trained humility actually leads to a deeper sense of humility, So, obviously any of us, if any of us practice just the simple virtue of humility, if we were going to refrain from arguments a lot, if we were going to become more conscious of how we react in certain situations, this is going to have a deeper effect on you. Though there still may be a lot of emotional triggers that, are going to get you out of your center, but that's a work in progress as well. So, but at the same time, I still believe that we have this innate humility within us that is kind of, I would say it's one of the pinnacles of spiritual life that we have. It's once we have it, we are, and the way we have that is, from being more receptive to the world, to allowing the world to be as it will without, trying to impose your will upon it. It's funny because when we kind of relinquish our will as one of the primary focuses in Buddhism, when you begin to relinquish your will, you realize there is this deeper power within you or this deeper essence within you that you come into contact with that you could not have come into contact with if you were always out here doing, trying to achieve, the aggressive kind of entrepreneurial state of mind that a lot of people in the world are in. Nothing against that, but there's a whole other world that we're kind of not nourishing because we're focusing too much on the, how's Jason or Ashton going to get ahead in the world if we're not doing this and barging through and so forth and so on. So I know a lot of people will be skeptical that humility is innate, but when we begin to blunt our sharpness and we begin to refrain from, being excessively a go-getter, we realize that there's something deeper inside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. In your book, the Science and Practice of Humility, you contextualize this all with calling it the great work of eternity. Could you kind of summarize for us what you consider to be this great work of eternity?
Well, the great work of eternity is basically, it's your dedication to the spiritual life as well. It's your dedication to the sacred. A lot of people believe this, these days spiritual has become kind of an accepted word. Everyone believes it's spiritual, but a lot of people are not necessarily ready for the work that it means to dive into this, what I call the great work of eternity, being more conscious of yourself, being dedicated to the sacred, whatever that may be for you, and also being dedicated to humanity as well. So, yeah, that's basically it in a nutshell, but it's more to do with self-work. So your dedication towards self-work, how willing are you to go all the way within knowing yourself truly? And, that gets tested a lot, especially as we were talking before, when you're living in society, that gets tested quite a bit, your sincerity to your own self-work, because there are a lot of emotional triggers, and family can do that, society can do that, your job can do that too. So,
well, I like the distinction personally that it is work. We're talking about this surrendering of the ego and kind of letting go and all that. At the same time, there is work involved. It's not just a matter of cool, I'm gonna do some peyote, or I'm gonna go to this meditation retreat. Now all of a sudden I've had some enlightenment experience, and now I just get it all and I can sail through life with this understanding. You have to continuously do the work, and eternity in and of itself implies that continuous moment of now. So we always have that work to do. I think the moment we think that we've attained some certain thing, we've put the blinders on and we're stuck, which is unfortunate.
Exactly. Well, that's like in Zen, it's, before enlightenment, chopping wood, after enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water. So it's kind of like, if you went to a master and you said to him, look, I've woke up, I'm enlightened now. They'd say, oh, that's cool. Now what? Now what are you going to do? Because, it's not just that you have to wake up. The work continues to go. You continue to marinate and refine your consciousness. You still have your unique sort of psychological center. That in itself does not evaporate. You still function as a person. So there is still work to be done. A lot of people, as you said, Ashton, think that, they've surrendered their ego and this and that, and then that's all they have to do. And then you stand on that person's foot and they bark at you like a dog, and then and there's this whole enlightened experience is over for them. So, I'm trying not to give anyone any BS in my work, and to explain to them that, look, though you do wake up, there's still a lot of things that have to be done, and that's a lifetime project. It's not something that probably will ever finish,
And you brought up in the entrepreneurial attitude, and it's something that it hits home to me, having lived abroad for so many years, kind of away from the world, and then coming back to the United States, where it's like, man, you got to hustle. It's not easy to make a living here and now. And so this entrepreneurial mindset takes over most people in that space, that really like, hey, if you do the work, you can achieve results, but it leads to a lot of other problems as well. And in your book, you catalyze some of this idea through talking about the relationship between the warrior and the sage. The warrior being this aspect both of chaos, and the sage being this aspect of order. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that and how you define this warrior, which to me fits into that entrepreneurial mindset of I'm gonna conquer the world, and then the sage, which is doing the inner work. Could you tell us a little bit how you define those two terms and how you work within that idea that you bring up as well of the order out of chaos?
Yeah. Well, in the book I talk about, two primary states of awareness. So you have the path of the warrior and the path of the sage. So basically, as you said, Ashton, the path of the warrior is kind of that go-getter entrepreneurial mindset. It's been probably the mindset that, not just in the West, but in the East, has been nourished mainly. It's about, how are you going to achieve anything without doing something, whereas a lot of deep Eastern thought obviously deals with paradox, because they say if you do nothing, then everything is achieved. They have these paradoxes in the East, which I'll get to in a minute. But the warrior's mentality is that, how can anything be fixed, or how can anything be healed in the world if we're not actually actively doing anything about it? And most of the time we're often telling each other what to do and how to do it, and how can this lead to any sort of peace in the world. And I know that when I was in America, for example, and I was lecturing, and we discussed this path of the warrior and the path of the sage, a lot of people, in America, I guess in Australia and Europe as well, but a lot of people were like, but how's anything going to get done? The warrior's got to do this and that. And it's like, I know that. And I know that a lot of people are attracted to Stoic philosophy and a lot of Western philosophies that are really go-getter philosophies. And I understand those philosophies, and I see the benefit of them. But, where does the game end where our agenda is being imposed onto other people? This is where I think my point in the book is, it's like, okay, though our strategy for the world may seem like this, does the other world accept our strategy and our agenda, or are we just going to impose our will upon them? And, we see this on an individual level, on a social level, and also on a geopolitical level. So that's kind of my point in the book, that this warrior is state of mind is always attracted to chaos, attracted to unpacking things, pulling them apart, finding what's the best for them, and then building an agenda based upon that. And as opposed to that, the path of the sage is kind of, I always use a city as an analogy. So if we look at a city, when you're caught in the detail of the city, you're in chaos. Everything is, there's people everywhere, cars everywhere, everything is crazy. But if you begin to, from a Boeing 747, from the view of a Boeing 747 or a helicopter, the city seems very harmonious and almost peaceful. Like there's a rhythm to the organism. And this is kind of the sage's state of perception, where they see that even though there may be trouble now, that eventually things will work out. They always have this kind of mentality. And we hear this a lot in the New Age. People say, this too shall pass, and so forth and so on. It doesn't mean that you don't, pay your bills and you don't attend to your daughter, or, these sort of things that have to be done. It just means that you have more of an objective perspective of what's going on in the world, especially when there is a lot of emotionally charged events in the world, or emotionally charged events in your life. Like if you have cultivated the ability, okay, this guy's pissed me off, but if I can see it from here, I'm not going to judge him according to my own emotions, and we'll try and deal with it as we go. But that's kind of like the sage's perspective, is that they're trying to advocate to us not to get caught in the detail too much. It's kind of like in the Hindu pantheon, they talk about the breath of Brahma. So the breath of, this is like in esotericism, the involution and evolution of consciousness. So you're involved and whatever has to be done has to be done, but they advocate for you always to have an evolved state of consciousness where you can see life from like a mountaintop instead of being caught in the city. And this is why in China, especially in China, they say, imagine if a sage was a king. Imagine how fortunate we'd be. And this has always been a mantra in China, but obviously a sage has never become a king. But their point is that if a sage had become a king, they would begin to see external events from a distance and maybe choose the correct way to deal with matters instead of just acting emotionally. And this is especially acting emotionally on a global scale is what's kept us down a lot. If we look at a lot of events in the world, we could talk about 9/11 or anything like that. If there was a bit more time to think about things with more of a critical mindset, then maybe we wouldn't have got ourselves in the mess that we're in now. So that's kind of the sage's perspective. So that's the differences in the dichotomy between the sage and the warrior. And that's how, and also what you were speaking about, the order and chaos, that ebb and flow of life. Like, again, the sage sees intrinsic order even within chaos. That's one of the main points of the book. So even though you think that things in your life now may be pretty shitty, that this too will change. And it's probably leading you on to something much greater as well.
Well, and I love that perspective of the city and viewing it from above from a plane. I often use the analogy of a forest, and if you're in the forest, you don't know where anything is, you're struggling to find water, all you see is trees. The warrior approach, will be to cut down all the trees so you can just figure out where you got to go. But the sage in this context would be, climb a tree, look to see, like, oh, there's a river. That river leads to that city over there. I don't have to cut anything down. I can just walk straight to that city or walk to the river to get water. I don't have to impose my force and will on everything as much. And as I said, it doesn't mean you just sit down and do nothing. And I'm just going to, I'm stuck in the forest. Let me sit and meditate and pontificate on life. No, you still go walk. You're still engaging, but you do it with that heightened perspective, which I think is so powerful and important.
Yeah, I love that analogy, Ashton, that you used at the forest. But and also you mentioned a critical thing there that a lot of people, I speak to a lot of my Western friends who might be pretty politically minded, and they think that okay, so you're into Eastern spirituality and stuff like that, so you just don't do anything. And it's like it's not so much like that. You still are actively engaged in the world, but your perspective is different. It's changed. You're not seeing it you're trying not to see it too much from Jason, the person. You're trying to see it from a vaster perspective. So this is where a lot of people actually get it wrong. They think that if you follow an Eastern path, you're obviously engaged in yoga. They think that if you're engaged in yoga, then so you're trying to just be shanty with the whole world. And it's like that you are trying to be shanty with the whole world, but at the same time, you still have your own personal life and your own personal beliefs. So they don't sort of disappear. You just the grip has been let go. That's the difference. Yeah.
Well, it's to say that it's not to encourage apathy, but rather, as you're saying, that perspective to view the world as a piece larger than our own limited impulses, feelings, thoughts, and the rest, which I'll speak for myself anyways, is difficult work. It's not easy to do, especially when you are being triggered, especially when you see things happening in the world that are contrary to your belief system. No matter which side of the spectrum one happens to lie on, it's very difficult to sit with that and say, you know what, someone else has a different perspective. How do I engage that in a way that is not purely from my own limited perspective, which usually that in of itself, to go from your perspective, just you butt heads with anyone with a different perspective, and that gets nowhere, which doesn't achieve anything either, which is difficult. You talk about mental alchemy. What is mental alchemy, and how does this tie into this conversation of humility?
Well, mental alchemy is kind of it's an ancient tradition from Egypt, from Hermes Trismegistus, and even the Gnostic tradition. in the Middle East. And this is different. A lot of people relate mental alchemy to the law of attraction and things and New Age concepts like this that a lot of people have become familiar with. But mental alchemy is a little bit different than that, because mental alchemy is about diminishing your personality to connect to something much larger than yourself. So this is the idea of aligning yourself with God, if you want, and God will use you as an instrument. To use Indian terminology, they say, to merge Atman, which is the transcendental self within, or to use the yogic terminology, Purusha, and which connects you to something much larger than yourself. So in Vedanta, that might be Brahman. And this is the divine ground. This is what kind of is the irreducible essence of the universe. We could say the power base of the universe, what animates life. And so they would say, connect with that in mental alchemy, and this is what produces dharma or de in Chinese, which is kind of like virtue or cosmic virtue. And dharma, in the sense, I mean virtue. I don't mean the Buddha's teaching or duty. It's a pretty inclusive word. It means many things. But in this sense, especially if we look at Taoism, they say that, the Tao can only make use of you if the mind is empty. So they use a lot of analogies like a house, what's valuable, or a cup is a better one. What do you value, the cup or the space within the cup? So these are kind of metaphysical analogies, metaphors to explain that when your mind is empty, the universe can use you. And this is what mental alchemy is. It's about bringing something to the world and transforming the world. And I speak a little bit about quantum physics and that in relation to this, because a lot of people have related, like, for example, the law of attraction to quantum physics, because they think that if they sit around and they hope that something's going to happen, it's going to happen. And as we know, that doesn't really happen. You're not going to get checks in the mail, as great as that may sound. But if you begin to empty yourself out, then you'll begin to find that things do fall into place. A lot of Western intellectuals, they understand this too, but they get a little bit skeptical about, the idea of a higher force or a higher power, or that we are connected to something collectively. They're a little bit skeptical of this. So that's basically what mental alchemy is. It's about emptying yourself out so that you can bring the change in the world that actually is needed, and that's not change from you as a personality. It's the change that is needed from a deeper place, a deeper perspective, So, deep down, I believe, and you may believe this too, Ashton, that we are all connected and we are the entire universe. And there are many methods to connect to that. There's many religious paths or spiritual paths to connect to that. And mental alchemy is basically just a byproduct of that. So, alchemy itself, alchemia means to fuse with God, or to fuse with the higher source. So, and I guess how that ties to humility is basically that you're not acting, especially from a very egotistical or personal place, which would be a place of agenda, a place of, Jason wants this for Ashton and he's going to do it no matter what. I wouldn't be coming from that perspective. I would be listening and open to what mutually we need for each other, instead of, what our own personal beliefs and opinions are.
Well, I'm glad you brought it back to humility, because I want to kind of bring it full circle again and start perhaps to say, how do you define humility, and how does all of this, the warrior, the sage, the perspective and everything else, tie back into that concept of humility?
Well, the way I see humility is I don't see it in the sense of, a lot of people think of humility as humiliation. They think that, humbleness is weakness. This is kind of a thing that, I learned this also in primary school. Teachers were saying, the humble man was the first man killed, and all these sort of things. And so crazy ideas. But I see humility itself as, paradoxically the most powerful force in the universe. It's something that we innately have. And if we have the ability to even just be humble, or even if you were just trying to cultivate humility in your life, this is going to benefit your life, tenfold. And this is, I believe, how we can nurture acceptance for each other, compassion for each other, and also have the strength to actually forgive each other. So I believe humility itself, as I said earlier, is like the pinnacle of our character, pinnacle of our spiritual life, that we can manifest in the world, you could say. It's a very Laozian idea where Lao Tzu would say, water seeks the lowest places in the world, but paradoxically, it's the most powerful force in nature. And so this is the way. And again, if you always come from a place of acceptance and trying to not react emotionally a lot, and if you practice non-reaction a lot, then you'll start to see how that in itself, acting from that humble place and taking the low road essentially sometimes actually contributes to more harmony in the world. And I know that may sound defeatist for a lot of people, because they might say, if that guy said this to me and he's wrong, I know he's wrong, I should say something. Even, he's aggressive and so forth and so on. Sometimes you've just got to take the bitter pill, as you said before, Ashton. Sometimes differences are actually, hard to mend, and so sometimes the low road is the best path to take. I'm not saying anyone should passively acquiesce in the world, but a lot of the time it's the best medicine for certain situations. I don't want anyone to be pushed over, but a lot of the time humility is the greatest medicine. So I see humility as the key to us moving forward as a species, especially individually, but also collectively, if we have that humble character.
Well, and so to clarify, or to draw it a little bit more, I'm assuming you're not saying you kind of said this, but to not allow yourself to be a victim of violence. We're not saying humility means, okay, well, this person's being violent, go ahead, just, punch me again, or destroy this, do that. But it's about perspective more than anything else, or from what I'm hearing, what you're saying. Is that right?
Definitely. No. I mean, if someone's going to be violent to you, you don't just sit there and cop a beating. That's not the point. Keep your wits about you, obviously. If you don't have your wits about you, you won't survive long in the world, that's for sure. It's about having this deeper perspective, about seeing the world, as we were talking earlier, from more of an objective place, which actually has an effect that you begin to accept other people, accept the world. You're not meeting the world anymore with resistance. You're accepting it, and that acceptance evokes humility. It evokes the humility within yourself to come into the world. And if those circumstances do come with someone who's violent, then you know exactly what to do. Either get the hell out of their way, or act accordingly. So I'm not saying, like we mentioned earlier, that if we look at any Eastern spirituality, it's not really about copying a beating and taking that low road. It's more taking the low road in the general life. When that sort of situation happens, do what you need to do. A lot of people think that if you have a belief in an idea, that you always have to follow it, and that's not always that true. Circumstances in life do change, which, as we talked before, Ashton, before the podcast, you were talking about your family. Circumstances do change, which make you have to move with whatever the situation is accordingly. Even though you might have these certain beliefs, they're not going away, but you have to do what is needed also.
Well, and so I'm hearing very much that through the work and through talking to you, this idea, how humility relates to a science, in that, through the greater perspective and allowing this openness, the receptivity, this lack of just reaction from the ego has effects not only within the self, but in the world. How do we relate to humility as a practice? So if we were to say to people listening, how can they practice in their lives? What are some actual things they could do to actively practice humility?
It's a good question. There's many things. Obviously, first of all, you need to start meditating. Meditation is obviously a key to understanding your own mind, understanding your own reactiveness. Even if you practice just basic mindfulness in everyday life, mindfulness itself will make you more conscious of your emotional reactions. So that's kind of step. I would say the basics of trying to practice humility is to just understand your own mind, see, react in certain situations, and that's an ongoing process. We're always challenged by certain emotional triggers that are always conjuring up deeper subliminal imprints within ourselves, subconscious imprints, what they call samskaras in Sanskrit, bringing up a lot of these that continue to fuel our karma, so to fuel our action. So understand more of that about yourself. Meditation, having more, I would say, harmonious relationships, like trying to, instead of, imposing your will on certain relationships you have, or your own perspective on certain relationships you have, just listen and pay attention to the relationships you have in your life. You'll find it funny that when you just pay attention to someone in your life who you love, or a friend, or anybody, that just that little bit of attention, begins to, heal wounds and begins to, cultivate or nourish more of that humility within yourself, instead of going to a certain relationship and telling them how it is. And obviously non-reactiveness. Non-reactiveness has got to be the key for humility, and acceptance, and, the ability to receive the world instead of imposing your will upon the world. And I know that's difficult, because most of your listeners and most people in the world have active jobs. They're in society. So we are active and we are engaged, but it doesn't mean that you have to be, you have to overstretch your arm, you could say, because once we overstretch, we're out of balance. To keep your balance, obviously do your work, do everything, but remember, try and stay within here. Everything we're experiencing is from within here. So try and stay within yourself, even though there's a lot of things that are emotionally trying to pull you out of yourself. It's the gravitational pull of the external world. So try and understand that, and try and differentiate between that, and just see what that, if that doesn't work, then, most people in history who have followed this are all liars, but it's all true. If you begin to do that, you discern between that, you will see that this has a tremendous effect on your own psychology, and also it has an effect on the people around you too. They notice that there's this, in Chinese they say de. So de means either virtue, or you could say charismatic power. They talk about kind of an aura that somebody has. And you have this do when you begin to practice that. You listen more. Listening is a key, to humility. We're in conversations, we're waiting our turn to speak and tell someone what we know, and we're not even listening to them. I find myself doing this a lot of the time. Most people do. It's a bad habit. But if we can be conscious of certain just little things like that, you begin to have more of this virtue that this charismatic power that I was just talking about. So simple things like that. It begins with mindfulness, begins with your relationships, and it begins with how you react to yourself, especially, and to others and situations in the world.
If you could leave someone with one crystallized idea of humility in the world, so anyone that was just happened to be walking in front of you, what would that idea be?
Wow, that's a good question, man. Well, I would ask them, like, how can anything be achieved in our world, or how can we know ourselves, the deeper essence of ourselves, without being humble? Can we know ourselves by being active, or can we know ourselves by projecting our agenda onto the world? Or do we know ourselves in the opposite direction, from the other perspective? Is it from blunting our sharpness? Is it from refining our consciousness? Is that how we heal the perceived problems in the world, and also problems within ourselves? So I would leave them with something like that. It's probably not too poetic, but I keep it simple. So I see humility as a foundational cornerstone for most people in the world, and I think that if we can all come into that, like what I just mentioned, if we can come into that understanding, and I think that a lot of things will change in the world. But it's a work in progress, Ashton, as you know. Not everyone can take the bait, hook, line, and sinker. So
definitely all a work in progress. Now I'm a huge reader. I would love it, especially in the declining age of people reading. So I'm in light of that and trying to encourage people to read more. I'm interested in what guests are reading. Are you reading anything right now that's really stimulating you, or is there a book that you would recommend for people other than, of course, your own wonderful work, but a book that you would recommend for people to read? It could be on any topic. I'm just curious about what people are reading and spread it out to other people.
Oh, for sure, man. I'm probably like yourself. I love reading books. So my works, especially you'll notice with Fasting the Mind, has gone a lot into the relationship between cognitive science and Eastern thought. There's actually a direct correlation there. So I've been reading a lot of books on cognitive science. So at the moment, I'm reading a book by Daniel Kahneman. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a Nobel Prize winner, and he's a psychologist. I wouldn't say it's the easiest book to read for most people. If you're not familiar with cognitive science or psychology in general, it might be a tough read, but it's a rewarding read. As for books I recommend for people, there's a lot. I would say there's a book to understand. There's a lot of thinking in the world, and this has kind of become the norm that a lot of people think, especially in the West, that there's one universal way of thinking. And this is kind of not really the case when we look at culturally about how the East and the West have evolved. I get into this also in Fasting the Mind. So a book I recommend that goes into this is called The Geography of Thought by psychologist Richard Nisbett. And it gets into a lot of the differences in the way the East and the West think, why the West became primarily more individualistic as opposed to the East, which was more more collective based. And my favorite book of all time is The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. So I love that book. I know it's not for everyone because Huxley had an IQ somewhere skyward of 200. So he was a genius in a sense, but it's a great book to understand what I was talking about earlier, the divine ground of being. So, he gets into the Western perspective, the Eastern perspective of that. And so that's basically what I recommend and what I'm reading at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Thanks for sharing. Now, you've got your next book coming out in May, which is Fasting the Mind, which you mentioned, where that will be coming out in May. So by the time this launches, that still won't be out yet. But where can people find out more about you, your books, your teachings, and all the offerings that you get?
Okay, cool. My website's jasongregory.org, so just my name. My books are all on Amazon. You can find my books on my website. My Twitter is JasonGregory33, and my Facebook is One World Within. I think Facebook.com/One World Within. So you can find me there. So that's basically everything's on my website. If you add me through social media networks, you'll see a lot of the things I'm posting and so forth and so on.
And you're not the Jason Gregory who's a game developer, because there is another Jason Gregory who's an author and he's got books on game development. So when I was researching, I'm like, wait a second, what's this guy coming? So, but just for if anyone's Googling, it's not that way.
I've been asked that many times, Ashton. When I'm doing publishing, they're like, geez, you're very diverse with your books, and it's like, that's not me.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show today, for sharing your insights with us. I really appreciate you and the work that you do. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Our pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And for all of our listeners out there, I hope you've enjoyed our show today. I hope you've learned something new, and I hope you all have a very present moment. Thanks for listening. Namaste. Hey everybody, it's Ashton here with an announcement. We're starting a weekly contest giveaway over at Savannah Spirit. If you'd like to enter into the contest to win one of our weekly prizes, go to savannahspirit.com/contest. If you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, we'd really appreciate it if you went over to iTunes, left us a review, leave us some comments, and share this podcast with anyone who you think might enjoy it. Also want to invite you to go check out Savannah East, which is the name of our blog and also the name of a Facebook group where I interact with guests and our audience. We'll post recent episodes up there as well as interesting articles relating to our guests and or the topics on the shows. And again, thank you so much for listening. Namaste.
You've been listening to the Savannah Podcast. To find out more about Savannah, go to savannahspirit.com or follow Savannah on Facebook at facebook.com/Savannah Spirit. For daily inspiration, check out our blog at savannaheast.com. Be sure to join us next week for a new episode, and thank you for listening to the Savannah Podcast.